So which characteristics distinguish successful movements for social change from unsuccessful ones? So you can see that this candidate has started a with an anecdote, but also a quotation. And then she's also identified a paradox, which I think is really interesting. So if you're an examiner reading this, you think, oh, they haven't, directly gone into the question and say, I think that the characteristic that distinguish successful movements in social change are blah, 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 blah. But she started by like an anecdote, and the person reading it is thinking, interesting. How does this fit in? It piques their curiosity and leaves them wanting to know why this is relevant. It's almost like telling a story. You're building up the argument itself. And then she's identified the contrast. And you can see that because she's kind of rephrased the question, and all this time that I've been repeating the question over and over to you and trying to identify the two different sections of the question that you need to answer in the ways in which they're interlinked. This is where you can start to summarize the question that I've given you. Put it almost in your own words. And also, methodological point as well, successful or unsuccessful. In our context would be, why is it the late 18th century and how can you apply economic growth, a watershed moment globally to so many different contexts. And you can see that she's referenced the quotation as well. So if you're going to mention a quotation, you should always explain why the quotation is relevant to the essay that you're answering. And you can say, I argue that this is happening, and you offer perhaps like an alternative lens to the question if you really substantially agree with it. And note that the paragraphs are actually quite short, and rather than having 5 paragraphs as you normally would in an exam question for school, she's made them quite short, to the point, and it follows a nice narrative structure as well. It makes it easy to read, so you don't want to have long paragraphs. She's also mentioned the evidence as well. And yeah, she's mentioned very precise evidence, and you can see later on that she's mentioned quite a few different contexts as well, which, depending on the angle that you want to take, I think is a good approach. She's integrated historiography as well. Just a brief note that you don't need to mention the full name. You could just say designed to produce what Novak describes as a close approximation of the now. You mention a quotation and you have the end note at the end so that people know where you got the quotation from. And she's analysed it as well. So policy may also appear to aid social change while undermining its proliferation at a grassroots level. She's mentioned different factors as well. I do think that one problem with the question title, sorry, the essay, that you would need to do in your essay is that she needs to engage a bit more with the historiography. In our context with economic growth one, there's so many different opinions, so many people have argued about it, especially economics, from an economic perspective versus historical perspective. So that's something that you need to bear in mind. But I do think the rhetorical questions and the kind of ways in which she's thinking really deeply about the question, not taking everything at face value, that's really excellent. And you can actually see in the second question, the alternative example that I've put a link on. They're also very good at thinking very deeply about the question title itself. And the way she talked about an alternative lens through which to evaluate, the idea of like an alternative lens is really good. And that's what real academics use as well when you propose like your own unique way of looking at things. So around point 3 or point 4, you should start thinking in those terms and talking about your own perspective as well. I think she could disagree a bit more with some historians though here. and where she talks about stagnant binaries of success and failure. Yeah, this is really interesting, and you can see that at the very end of the conclusion, she's almost made it almost philosophical in a way by saying movements of social change will never be definitively successful or unsuccessful. It means the person stops reading the essay and thinks, like maybe this is true, maybe this is interesting. So it's not just about history at this point, but it's a wider philosophical point that you're making.